Hi, we are Frank and Beth Radcliff. Before we get started today, we wanted to say thank you for all of you who've been praying for us and for disciples here in the United States. With the racial injustices and subsequent protests and violence, and with the reopening of parts of the country while coronavirus cases still increase in some parts of the country, it's been a difficult couple of weeks. And we are doing well, we are safe, but we do appreciate your prayers. Yeah. Now today, as we get a chance to talk about parenting, we're actually excited for the privilege of doing it. This is something we enjoy doing and enjoy talking about. So today, we're going to take a look at some lessons that come from Principles 3 and 4 of Sam and Jerry Lang's book, The Essential 8 Principles of a Strong Family. We're going to focus today on connections and communication. That connection is one of the core emotional needs that a child has. And we're going to talk about those connections on a heart level, that having that relationship with our child, where we're not just talking about behavior and obedience, but we're talking about the heart. So as we focus on that today, we're going to take a look at communication, but also the heart.
You know, building connections with your children is really one of the most important things you'll do as a parent.
Yeah.
It will bring you the deepest joys in the years to come, and it will also see you through the challenging times that all of us experience at some point with our children.
We're going to take a look today at a passage that I love in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, starting down in verse 11. You know, very often in teaching, we take Bible stories about family, and we make illustrations to the church. This is one where Paul was talking to the churches, and we're going to make an application to families. Down in verse 11 of 2 Corinthians chapter 6, it says, "We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children, open wide your hearts also." You know, I think most of us have had those occasions when our children haven't shown us a lot of affection, when they kind of have resisted that, when maybe they've been quiet or wanting to be with themselves or resisting our questions or wanting to talk with them. And I think there's a very important key in this verse. Paul talks at the beginning saying, we've spoken to you freely. We've opened wide our hearts to you. And so as we expect our children to be open with us and to share their lives with us, we have to first be open with them.
You know, and I think it's important and probably obvious that we want to be age appropriate and topic appropriate when we're open with our children. We don't want to burden our children with all our issues or problems, and we don't want our teenager to be the prime person that we confess to. But there are many ways that we can be open with our children in our communication. For example, maybe you've had a tough day at work and you're riding with your child in the car, and you can say, "I got really angry at this coworker today, but you know what? I went back and apologized, and it was hard, but I am so glad I did." You know, that's a vulnerability and an openness. Perhaps somebody hurt your feelings, and you could share with the child, you know, somebody hurt my feelings and it made me really sad, but I went back and talked with that person, and we have completely worked things out. You know, again, you're showing your child how to be open as well as how to resolve issues. And you can even give your child insights into your spiritual walk. Maybe you've had some trouble reading your Bible regularly. You could talk with your teenager and say, you know, I've not been reading my Bible really regularly every day, and I really want to do better in that. Feel free to ask me how I'm doing, and I guarantee you a teenager will be happy to check up on you in that way. Whether or not they're reading their Bible or not, it doesn't matter. You've given them permission to enter your life. You know, in these kind of conversations, they model vulnerability for our children, and they really show our children what it looks like to live an open-hearted life.
As we talk about open-hearted connections, we're going to use a couple verses here from Ephesians chapter 4. It's a great chapter. Encourage you to read the whole thing, but we're going to draw out 3 points from it. And the first one is down in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15. It says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Him who is the head, that is Christ. And as our family grows spiritually and grows closer to Christ, following the instructions that are here, speaking the truth in love, is going to be an important part of that. We need our communications to be direct and to be honest, to say the things that we're seeing and to do it in the right kind of way. But as we think about truth, you know, sometimes in thinking about truth, we think just about what we're feeling and what we want. But to find out the truth of what is in the heart of our children, we need to ask questions and we need to see what's going on in their lives. Sometimes we'll see children get very quiet, or they'll kind of get moody or get down. And sometimes, especially if it's a negative sort of attitude that we're sensing, we may want to avoid that. And we may just want to ignore them and get away. Now, in the lockdown, it's been a little harder to get away. But we may want to do that. I'm encouraging you to be direct, to ask questions, to say, hey, I've noticed you've been moody. What's going on? You know, what can we help you with? You look like you're getting upset. Is that something we've done? And putting things out there with questions. The other part with dealing with truth with children is understanding that if they tell you the truth, even if it's something that they've done wrong or not done in the best way, a mistake that they've made, that we listen to and are gracious and appreciative of the fact that they're telling us the truth. If they come to us and tell us the truth, there still may be consequences for the actions, but the consequences should be a lot stronger if they lie to us or don't tell us the whole story. That at least within our family, was always a much bigger deal. And not just when they were young and did little things, but when they got older, that the consequences of lying to us were more significant, because to have a connection, you've got to have honesty and have to have the truth.
That's right. You know, but the scripture adds a part to that truth telling that's really, really important, and that is to speak the truth in love.
Right.
We've all studied this before, but I think it's so important to remember that as we speak to our children, we always need to do so having their best interests in heart. We shouldn't be speaking to them to make ourselves feel better, to hurt them, or to punish them. We should always speak with love. And that means we speak with kindness and with gentleness and with patience. It means we look at the tone that we use with our children, and it means we consider the words that we use when we speak. Words spoken are out there and they can never be taken back. And so it's so important to consider our words and not say something that we regret later. You know, as I think about speaking the truth in love, that doesn't mean we're softies. There are certainly times to be very firm with our children, but it is always the right time to be loving with our children as we speak. You know, truth with love builds connections with our children, but truth spoken without love usually puts up walls. So we really want to be able to learn what it means to speak the truth in love.
That's right. The second lesson we'd like to take from Ephesians chapter 4 is down in verses 26 and 27. And it says there, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Now, I'm not sure about you, but when we're in close quarters for a long time, the stress builds, and there's gonna be things our children do that make us angry. There's gonna be times that we feel anger. There's gonna be times that they feel anger. Remember, not only are they with us a lot, we're with them a lot. And so there are the things that happen that cause that stress. And so you're going to feel anger, that's going to happen. That's a natural emotion that's happened. And notice this verse doesn't say, don't be angry. Sometimes as we see emotions rising with our kids, we may say to them, don't be angry. Well, I'm not sure about you, but that doesn't work very effectively with me. But it is proper to say, in your anger, don't sin. And so that reaction that we have when we let anger get to us, and when we say things that are hurtful, when we say things to tear down, when we say things to inflict injury, that's when we're violating this verse.
Right. As Frank said, anger in our homes is really inevitable. Often with little children, it's not intentional that they make us angry, but honestly, with older children, they may know what our buttons are and may push them to make us angry. But we have to always remember that we are the adults,
right,
and that we need to be prepared. We need to know that this may come,
right,
and to be prepared to be self-controlled. There was one time that I was out of control, and I was yelling at one of my daughters. It was terrible. But as I was yelling at her, I caught a glimpse of my face in a mirror that was just behind her, and I was horrified at what I saw. I was horrified at what I looked like, and I thought, what must I look like through this child's eyes?
Sure.
It made me realize that I cannot react in ways that I'm out of control,
right,
and in ways that frighten my children,
right,
or that would ever hurt them emotionally, right, or physically.
Right. The third lesson we'd like to take from Ephesians chapter 4 is down in verse 29. And as we read there, it says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. I remember using this verse to try to convict guys to not curse when we were doing sin studies. But, that isn't the unwholesome talk it's really talking about here. Notice what follows that don't use any unwholesome talk. It says only what's helpful for building others up. Mm-hmm. The wholesome talk is talk that builds people up. I'm one of those guys that I look and I see the negative. I tend to be critical when I see things. I remember looking at our children's report cards, the grades that they got each semester. And our kids overall did very well in school. We have one that was mostly A's with a few B's here and there, and did very well. But as a parent, the first thing I saw was if a grade went down from an A to a B, I wanted to know why. Why had that gone down? Rather than praising her for how well she did and how smart she was. And that's what would be helpful for encouraging her and building her up. In one of the lessons that we did in one of the regions in Johannesburg, I remember a brother talking about when he got into the house at night after work and he saw his son there, that the very first thing he saw was all of the things his son hadn't done yet. If there were messy clothes, or his shoes were out of place, or his books hadn't been put away, or the dishes weren't cleaned up, those were the things that he saw, and usually the first things that he said. And rather than asking, how was your day? How are things going? How are you doing in getting your work done tonight? Instead of those questions and conversation to build a connection, often it was criticism and correction as the very first thing. And it makes so much of a difference if we look for the words that build our children up.
Right. And what's really great about this verse is it doesn't just simply say build them up, right, but it says build them up according to their needs.
Right.
And that makes it such a personal thing. I think it's important for all of us at different times to stop and ask ourselves, do I really know my child?
That's right.
Do I know who they are?
Yeah.
Silly things. Do we know their favorite color? Do we know who their best friends are, both at church and at school? Do we know what their dreams are? Do we know their fears? Do we know our children? And we get to know our children by paying attention, by studying them, watching, observing things they say, tuck away the memories when we hear them share something. Sometimes it's asking questions, not interrogating, but just being there, being a good listener when they talk. And I think it's important to remember that our children change as they grow. We had one daughter who, as a maybe late elementary, early middle school, loved sunflowers. Everything in her room was sunflowers, all the pictures and the notebooks, and she had a blue shirt with sunflowers all over it. But we didn't catch the fact that she changed. And it was in her high school days. She finally came to me and said, "Mom, no more sunflowers." She had grown and changed, and we were not building her up according to her needs by continuing to give her sunflower things.
When you think about that, according to the needs and communication, that how we talk to different children are different. For those of you that have multiple children, I'm sure you've learned that what worked with one child doesn't necessarily work with the second one. That one of our children was very sensitive, and you had to be careful about how you said things to her. One of our children really wanted reasoning, more intellectual in terms of the discussions, that you had to give facts and you had to give background, and it was frustrating for her if she didn't have that. And so know the emotional needs that your children have, and how you talk with them really is going to be different. And certainly with boys and girls, how you talk to them will often be different. I'd like to talk for a minute to the fathers. That I think it is more difficult oftentimes for fathers to make a connection with their children than it is mothers. As we traveled around Southern Africa, I talked with a lot of fathers, some of whom who had good examples in their lives, and others who hadn't had that kind of connection with their own father. For some, their fathers had worked away in the mines or had worked in the city while they'd stayed in the village. And often the interactions in those cases were ones that when they saw their father, that there often was correction or punishment or, not just time to spend together and to connect. So as we work to do things differently and to have those connections with our children as fathers, I want to call us back to Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4. It says there, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." And if you look over in a parallel verse over in Colossians 3 verse 21, it says, "Fathers, do not embitter your children." And in some translations it says, "Don't provoke." So when we think about what provokes our children, one of the biggest things that I've seen is harshness and anger. That when children are regularly spoken to in harsh tones, that something happens in their reaction and it's hurtful. Sometimes children react in anger. Other times they withdraw, and that's where it talks about in Colossians that they can become embittered. And so our tone, we need to be very careful with that and work to correct in a way that trains and that instructs rather than in a way that damages and tears down. I think of other things that might exasperate our children. For me, one of the big things was not getting an answer, or getting an answer that said, "Why can't I do something? Because I said so." And it's that simple put down that says it in a way that doesn't give an explanation. It can be very frustrating for a child. Now, there's some situations when you've been asked the same thing 1,000 times where there is a reason to assert parental authority. But most of the time, if we follow that scripture in Ephesians chapter 6, we should be training, we should be instructing, we should be giving be giving reasons. And when we do that, we help them grow and mature. We help them learn. We help them change. And that's our role as fathers. And with that, we develop that strong connection with them so that when the big things come up, we've got a relationship and we can talk. In Principle 4 of the Essential 8 Principles, there are a couple of lists that Beth and I have found very useful in helping us and growing in our communication that helps deepen those connections. And as we look at that list, first of communication builders, I'd like you to take a look through that. And as we look at each other, very often we can see the strengths in each other very easily. And I look at Beth and I look at that first one that talks about daily dialogue. And Beth really worked hard to have that with our girls when they were home, but now even as they've gone on to their own lives, of having that one-to-one time and having a very consistent relationship that allowed for that connection. One of the others that I think of Beth with when I look at that list is copious compliments, of finding the good, even in the middle of times when, there may be a lot of issues going on, of being able to point out the good that's being done. I called it sometimes catching them doing good, that it's so easy to find issues, but praising what you can praise. And Beth does that very well.
When I look at that list, I see a lot of Frank's strengths in communicating on that list. The one that jumps out at me is the special times and places, and he really made this a priority with our girls. Every Saturday, he went and had breakfast with one of the girls, just one-to-one time with a daughter, and every year he took all three girls, just the four of them, and went to a local amusement park and spent the whole day together, and just made so many special memories. And how is that a means of communication? Well, what spending special times and places does is to communicate to our children that they are valuable, that they are worthy, that we love and want to be with them. The second thing on that list of builders that I see in Frank is learning to communicate it at different levels. It's easy to start with just the facts, but getting deeper and learning emotions is so important. Proverbs 20 verse 5 that's referenced there says, "The purposes of man's heart are deep, and it's the wise man or the man of understanding that draws them out." And Frank really did this with each of our girls, but I think in particular one of our girls was very, very tender-hearted and got her feelings hurt a lot.
Pretty easy.
A lot by Frank, in fact. But he pursued that relationship, and he got to understand our daughter and understand how she felt and thought and what the emotions were behind her feelings. And even today, they have a very warm and deep bond that they share.
As we think about those strengths, some of them are going to jump out and are going to be easy for us to do. And those we should really accentuate in our relationships with our children. Others will be a little more difficult, and those we should put some effort into and grow in so that we can build those connections.
That's right.
The second list we'd like to share with you is called communication killers. It's those things that we do that, as Beth mentioned earlier, build a wall rather than helping make a connection. And that list can be a little more convicting and sometimes a little harder to read through. There are a lot of them here that I can relate to at times in my life. But one of my weaknesses or challenges is listening. And so both the first and second one listed here, but I wanted to mention for a minute about defensive listening. That verse that's quoted here in Proverbs chapter 18, verses 13 to 15, it talks about when we don't listen, that we actually can crush someone's spirit. And so when we think about that defensiveness, I know that often when someone says something to me, I start trying to justify my actions, why I said what I did, think about how to answer them, and deflect sometimes the admonishment, the encouragement, the correction that's coming, rather than accepting it and listening openly. And that can get in the way of communication and understanding. And the second one that I think of here is the cutting critical remarks. You know, growing up, sarcasm was a part of my daily life and in my family, but then later on with guys that I was friends with in college, we got good at being sarcastic with each other and who could get the best cut in on things that were said. And I found with living with a tender-hearted wife and then having 3 daughters that my sarcasm and sense of humor got me in trouble an awful lot. And it didn't build up, it tore down. And the verse that's used here is the one we just talked about in Ephesians 4:29, that those cutting critical remarks, they don't build up and they don't look at the needs of the individual. So this is one I had to make some serious changes on within my life to have connections with the women in my life.
Yeah. You know, when I look back, like Frank, there's some things I may have done right, but I also see some things I didn't do well at all with the kids. And when I look at those communication killers, the first one that jumps out to me is the distracted listener. And I'm sure there are those of you who can relate to just feeling busy all the time. You are busy, you are multitasking, you are focused on lots of things, and you don't listen well. And that was me. I'll never forget one time I got up off a long conversation, discipling somebody, and one of my daughters came up to me and she said, "Mom, you spend more time talking to other people than you do with me." And that really cut me like a knife. And it made me realize that I need to make sure that my children know that they are worthy of my attention when they speak, and they're worthy of me listening to them carefully. That's what builds connections. And the other one I looked at on that list that reminded me of myself was the one that was associated with Philippians 2, that talks about doing everything without grumbling or complaining. And I kind of put nagging into that category. You know, so much of a mother's conversation with her children is, did you do this? Did you pick up that? Have you done your homework? Where are your chores? You know, and a lot of that is necessary in our lives. But if that's all we talk about, or if that makes up the majority of our conversation with our children, we really are putting walls up. We are not building bridges with them. And it's important that we consider how much we're nagging and how much we're encouraging.
Right. You know, as we think about our communication and think about building those open-hearted relationships and an open-hearted environment, it's so important to do this all of the time, and to do this when children are younger and when they grow and when they get into those more awkward years and teenage years. You know, if we expect our children to be open when the issues are serious and when they're important and when they're difficult, it had to have happened at other times and times before then in order for those crucial conversations to take place. We'd like to end today with, again, a couple questions for you to consider both individually and for some of you together in your groups. The first I'd like you just to reflect on is, how open-hearted is the communication between you and your children? What challenges do you have here? And then the second thing we'd like you to do is take a look at that communication builders list and identify 2 strengths that you have, and then identify 2 areas that you think that you need to grow in. And lastly, we'd like you to look at that communication killers list and look at 2 areas that you identify with there, and just be honest with yourself. And how does that affect your relationships with your spouse and also with your children? We thank you very much for being with us on this journey, and we love all of you and pray for you.